from among the church representatives.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Matthew McGrath.
I too want to welcome our guests here today and thank them for their offerings and their wise words. Mr. O'Donnell, some references by witnesses here during the week have been made to the C case in 1996-97 of a young girl that was taken into care by the authorities and who was brought to Britain for an abortion, allegedly because she was suicidal. Do you have any information that you can give this committee on the possible implications of that case? And also, I'd like to thank you very much for your words and offered here today about your experience in Southampton and indeed the extremely harrowing words and questions that you have to deal with as late as 20 years after unfortunate abortions have been carried out. And Ms. O'Brien as well, as a woman, as a mother and a teacher, I thank you for your words. And I think very pertinent words before this committee and any committee at this point in time in relation to suicide, because I believe that you're right in saying that there is somewhat of a normalising of suicide and an effort to do that. And, you know, I want to thank you for your words because I think that we're very near an epidemic in this country with suicide at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. And finally in this segment, I'm going to ask Deputy Ciara Conway.
Thanks very much, and to thank all the speakers for their presentations. Dr. De Fuita, if I might start with you, you made reference in your contribution stating from records that you've examined that no women going to the UK have gone for life-saving abortions. And I would put it to you that over the last number of days, we have heard evidence that directly contradicts that statement. Evidence from medics who said it's commonplace to refer women to the UK for abortions. And we heard this both from obstetricians and from psychiatrists. So maybe you'd respond to that point. Ms. O'Brien, in relation to one of the contributions that you made I suppose theorised about where we're going in relation to what we have to do and what's faced before us as a government. You made reference to asking obstetricians to scrub up and to go in and to intervene and to somehow, you know, to take the life or to deliver a child early and what the consequences of that might be. But what I would say to you, what we are trying to do as a committee, as a government, is to give women choices. To give women choices about getting access to life-saving treatment. And so maybe you'd respond to that. And just finally, Dr. O'Donnell, in your submission, you speak about how the government is proposing to drag psychiatrists into a draconian position of having to commit women while they're assessed if they're unwilling to stay voluntarily for assessment. Again, we have heard evidence to the contrary in relation to this, that we've heard from obstetricians and from a number of psychiatrists, and that they would say that in best practice in relation to medicine that you would often get a second opinion. But at no stage was there any talk of committal of women. And if a woman is suicidal, psychiatrists have told us that they would believe them. And so why, in your estimation, would we have to somehow commit women?
Thank you. We might start with Mr. O'Brien this time, and if Ms. Stevens come in, you're more than welcome to as well, in terms of the replies to the first 4 sets of questions.
Just to deal with Deputy Conway's question first, in relation to allowing women to access life-saving choices, that's exactly what I would really love you to legislate for. But I would just ask you, do you have a certainty, such a certainty, that you can legislate on the grounds of suicide as life-saving, given the evidence that having had an abortion, some women continue to be suicidal and some tragically succeed? That's what I would offer to you. There's no medical evidence to suggest that it's in any way helpful. And the closest people have come is it just might be part of a package. You can't actually legislate on those grounds. In relation to, I leave it to the greater expertise of the psychiatrists and doctors to deal with situations, other situations, but as to what would actually change. But I'll give you a laywoman's opinion on what might actually change. We're social creatures, and we respond to social norms. And when something is legalised, it's a far bigger educator than I ever will be in a classroom. And it'll have a far bigger impact because it is stating that this is permissible and possible, and that where our minimum moral value used to sit now sits a little bit lower. And because we're social creatures, that has an impact, and it's a change in culture. It's a change in culture. That's what we're talking about. And it's very, very serious. We have seen the impacts of change in culture in other areas, in the tragic area of suicide and in many other areas. And it's very, very serious what we're speaking about. Ms. Dean, would it be okay if Ms. Dean spoke on that?
I've actually asked Ms. Ms. Dean, go ahead, yes, please.
Just to come in, just to respond briefly to Deputy Kelleher's question about what's to be done, there have been concerns raised by some doctors in particular about the criminalisation of abortion. And I'd say two things about that. The first is, as Ms. Caroline Simons of the Pro-Life Campaign has said, what is central to the 1861 Act is the issue of intent. So there is no legal reality to the idea that a doctor might be prosecuted under the Act if he or she acts in good faith to protect the life of the mother while doing all they can, obviously, to save the life of the baby. And it's also important, as regards criminalisation, there's been some discussion of the decriminalisation of abortion. That's a very worrying suggestion, because the 1861 Act doesn't just apply to doctors, it applies to anybody who attempts to procure an abortion. It has an important function in deterring backstreet abortions. It also deters abortion clinics opening up on the streets of our towns and cities, such as we recently saw in Belfast. And as Ms. Breed O'Brien was saying, it sends out an important signal that the criminalisation of the offence of abortion, it sends out an important signal to society that it is a morally grave act to destroy the life of an unborn child. And I should also note that the sections 58 and 59 of the 1861 Act are actually still in force in Britain, where abortion is widely available. And even there, they recognise that there may be some circumstances in which it is appropriate and necessary to bring a prosecution for someone who carries out an abortion. I'd also, just in terms of summing up over, as regards the evidence that has been heard, I'd like to bring to the attention of the committee the fact that there has been a divergence of views from both the medical community and the legal experts who were heard yesterday. The Bar Council and the Law Society are conspicuous by their absence. They both issued statements, I understand, to the effect that they couldn't adequately represent the divergent views of all their members. What they're recognising, these are the organisations who represent the legal experts in this country, and they're recognising that this is not a technical legal issue, it is a moral issue, it is a value judgment, it is a matter of opinion. We all have different views on that. And I think it's important to remember that. So ultimately, this is a political decision. It's a value judgment. What do we want our values as a society to be? I would respectfully submit to the committee that the current medical practice, where everything is done to save both the life of the mother and the baby, where doctors are protected in carrying out those functions, is what we want to see retained. I'm an expectant mother myself. I want to be sure when I need the services of an obstetrician that he or she will not intervene unless and until there is a real and substantial risk to my life. Because before that point, the appropriate medical treatment is to admit me to hospital if necessary, give me all medical care that I need. The risk, it should be said, may dissipate. But if it increases and becomes a risk to my life, then by all means, I want the doctor to intervene to save my life. I have 3 children at home and a husband who depend on me. So that's current medical practice, and all we would like to see is that protected and enshrined in the law.
Thank you. Mr. Manley?
Yes.
And if Pat wants to come in as well, you may please as well.
In reply to Deputy Kelleher, yeah, if you asked Family and Life, would they would they want a referendum to roll back the suicide provision in the X case? Yes, the answer would be definitely yes. And this brings up the matter that was so often repeated during the week, and indeed has been said by no less than the Minister for Justice, that the 1992 referendum and the 2002 referendum confirmed the correctness of X and the support of the Irish people. Now, I happen to have lived through 1983, 1992, and 2002. My grey hairs show the work that I put into trying to get the vote out. And I have to tell you that the 1992 referendum of Albert Reynolds had really two questions in it. It asked the people, do they want termination? And that was the word used in the wording, accepted. And then they asked, do you want the suicide provision removed? So people, especially pro-life people, and excuse me for using this shortened version, but pro-life people felt caught between two opposite poles, and they felt they had to vote against it. And in 2002, there was again the same question asked, do you want the suicide provision removed? But unfortunately, there was a deep division among pro-lifers, and a large number voted against the 2002 referendum. So I think it is quite incorrect to say that most of the people in Ireland support the suicide provision. I think my colleague wants to add something.
If there's time remaining, just in relation to the question of whether we want a referendum, and I suppose why would we want a referendum, it relates to the deep problems with the suicide provision of the X case ruling. And that's a problem that's been recognised for the past 20 years. It's really the main reason why the X case has not been legislated for, and various attempts have been made by successive governments to remove that problematic element. It's not unique to Ireland that a Supreme Court would make a faulty decision. I mean no disrespect to the court. It was an extremely difficult case that they were faced with, and I certainly don't envy the task they were given. We can see, for example, from other countries, Supreme Court decisions that have subsequently been recognised as being deeply flawed and indeed repudiated. In the United States, for example, the Dred Scott decision in the middle of the 19th century, which upheld the principle of slavery, the Buck versus Bell decision in the 1920s, which justified forcible sterilisation of women judged to be unfit. And indeed, more recently in the United States, the Roe versus Wade decision, which has not been reversed, but the previous two have. What those three decisions have in common is that they introduce the idea that some people are less equal than others, some lives are less valuable than others. And that's the same principle that informs the suicide provision of the X case decision, that the life of the unborn may in certain circumstances be deliberately targeted.
Thank you. Dr. O'Donnell.
Thank you. I've tried to combine some of the questions.
Sure.
Just to start off with, in relation to the cases that are recorded of in relation to Irish women who would have travelled, you gave a figure of 130,000. You're wondering if some of these cases could have included women with suicidal intent. We obtained a Freedom of Information disclosure from the Office of Population Census and Surveys in England and Wales last August. And amongst from 1992 up until 2011, which are the most recent figures, there were 2 women who gave reasons along mental health grounds. No one gave the reason of suicidality. One of the grounds was mental illness. That was the phrase used. And the other one was depressive disorder. And in my experience, as in the experience of all of the psychiatrists who've given evidence here this week, abortion has never been indicated, is not reported in any journal or textbook as being a treatment for either mental illness or depressive disorder. So I hope that answers that question in particular. I've combined the questions in relation to the treatment of acute suicidal intent and the last question in relation to the procedures that would be followed. As I mentioned, some of the procedures would be considered as quite draconian. The problem with the presentation of someone who is acutely suicidal is that, in fact, they're presenting as someone who is usually acutely stressed, usually in the context of having recently discovered that they're pregnant, or later on in their pregnancy having discovered that, say, a relationship has broken down and they no longer have the support that they have. The key thing to do in that situation, and it's the same for anybody who is assessed or who is considered to be at risk of suicidality, is to carry out a thorough assessment of their psychiatric history and their mental state at that time. And if it's a case that there are 2 psychiatrists needed in order to provide a specific opinion, the process doesn't change. And in fact, Dr. Sheehan did refer to this. He did refer to this when he said that in our profession we will see people who are profoundly depressed, and clearly the intervention in that case is to admit them to hospital and support them and help them, and not go in and make a decision that's permanent or irrevocable. Now, when he spoke about that the intervention in that case is to admit them to hospital, what I should point out is that the process of admitting someone to hospital involves them either agreeing to be admitted to hospital or disagreeing. But under the only legislation we have there is the Mental Health Act of 2001. And if someone is deemed to be at immediate risk of suicide, acutely suicidal, they have to be admitted to a place of safety. So we're restricted by law. We can't just say, well, okay, we accepted you're suicidal, but you go away now, we'll go off home or whatever, and come back and we'll have a second opinion. They have to be admitted. And in this situation, most of them will not want to be admitted to hospital. So you're obliged in that situation, ethically and legally, to detain them under the Mental Health Act. Now, that is draconian. And that is what this government's purporting to do.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll have no questions.
So
Thank you.
that's what the government is going to bring in.
Dr. DeFrida.
Yeah, sure. I'll just address the question, I guess, that was directly addressed in relation to the UK abortion statistics. I think the first thing I'll say is we either believe these statistics from the Department of Health or we don't. You know, these are not something that I just conjured up. These are actual statistics released from the Department of Health under Freedom of Information and freely available to everyone. We've often heard abortion figures quoted by, pro-abortion lobbyists in the past, so we either believe them or we don't. In response to a Freedom of Information request that I made on behalf of the committee to the Department of Health statistics, specifically requesting information on how many abortions were performed on Irish women under the grounds to save their lives, I was given a whole range of information. The UK Abortion Act categorises abortions from A to G. F and G directly relate to where there is a risk to the life of the mother, and abortions performed for that reason, and they account for those figures. I was told by the operator of the Department of Health, Freedom of Information Officer, that there were 0 abortions performed in an 18-year period between 1992 and 2010, which was the only period he had access to, the only period he would give me, on Irish women in England, under grounds F and under grounds G. I also inquired under grounds A out of interest, because grounds A and B also relate to women's health. Under those grounds, I was informed that there were only 10 abortions carried out on an 18-year period on an Irish woman in England, and category A is where there may, during the course of pregnancy, present like a life-threatening condition.
Thank you.
But when you if I just may finish this is an important point. When you examine those 10 abortions and look at the reasons why those abortions are carried out, only 3 of those 10 are actual physical medical conditions, and the rest are mental illness, depressive disorder, as Dr. O'Donnell said, and failed abortion attempts. They were the other 7, and those 3 physical medical conditions are conditions that can be treated in Ireland that do not require the direct termination of life of the unborn.
Thank you, Dr. Very kindly.
Thank you. As most of the questions that you raised, I think, have been answered, I'll confine my remarks.
With the microphone, please. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Is that better?
Thank you. And the seat goes back, yeah.
Okay, as most of the questions that were raised, I think, have already been answered, I'll confine my remarks to the one that I think perhaps wasn't answered, which was from Deputy Conway, which she raised the issue that had been said by one of the obstetricians that, well, I suppose you had from the obstetricians a very clear message that they have no difficulty acting at present within current legal guidelines to do whatever is necessary to save the life of a pregnant woman. And I think that's probably one of the most important and clear messages that you've got in these last 2 days. And they gave very specific even figures as to how often that might occur and whatever, which I think is extraordinarily helpful. One of them, I believe, did raise the issue about referring women who did not fit within that category and referring those women to England. I suppose, first of all, you'd have to say that, I think, is outside of your brief, because that would not come within the test of the X case. The X case was where the woman's life was at risk, and further, that it could only be saved by terminating that, by ending the pregnancy. So you're into then the whole area of values. And the truth is that you will find within the medical community, as you will find within the legal community, you will find people with different values, and in particular with the value that they would give to the life of the unborn. And I think there's a danger in thinking that doctors all think the same way, sort of about all sorts of issues. In fact, I think, Mr. Buttimer, you received an email. I got one last night, a copy of an email that I think you received from a number of obstetricians.
I said this morning at our opening session.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Which was interesting. While they have, none of them are disagreeing about the management of women with life-threatening illnesses, but where they are disagreeing is whether or not there is a need for legislation, for a change to what the position as it is at the moment. And I think that's a reality that, if you like, is outside of your ambit, in fact, at the moment. The other thing that I think is worth saying here is that we actually have very useful information on why Irish women go abroad for abortions. It's the Women in Crisis Pregnancy study, which was done by researchers in Trinity College at the behest of the Minister for Health. And in that, what you find overwhelmingly is its social reasons, are the reasons why women go abroad for abortion. And that's also a challenge, I do think, for government, who have a role to play in addressing some of those reasons.
Thank you. Senator Colin Burke.
Thank you, Chairperson.
I beg your pardon, my apologies. Did you want... Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to answer Deputy O'Quailon's question, which was his wishful thinking, I think, the idea that I had said the government should be demolished. What I had said, actually, was that the totality of the evidence that you've heard over the last couple of days has completely demolished any argument that suicidality can only, which is the X case requirement, or ever be treated by abortion. And I think that being the case, we know that women's actual needs when they're suicidal and pregnant will not be addressed by abortion, and therefore it would be madness to legislate for it.
Thank you very much. Senator Burke.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to all of the speakers here this morning who've given a very good summary there of the issues. Just in relation to the X case, and the argument put forward this morning was that there was no medical evidence given to the court in relation to the X case. Doesn't that then put forward the argument, the need for legislation? Because if the legislation specifically set out that it must be, say, the two psychiatrists who must sign off on the issue, then the court is clearly guided in that situation. That's one issue. The second issue is that, you know, I think some of the comments in relation to, I think the vast majority, and there's 126 obstetricians working within the 19 maternity units across the country. I think all 126 of them, their view is that at all times they must protect the life of the mother and the life of the child. So any change in legislation, I don't think is going to change their views on that. That's their priority. But one of the things that they are looking for is clarity. And the issue put forward this morning was that it should be regulation rather than legislation. And I put forward the argument, and I gave the example this morning about where there's regulation without legislation. And if you're saying that regulation can be brought in at the moment, additional regulation without legislation, or even under existing legislation, what existing legislation are you saying that regulation and guidelines can be brought under? And the next question then is, can that still be tested in the courts at a later stage if the legislation, if there's a lack of primary legislation dealing with that regulation, and I think that needs to be clarified.
Deputy Dennis Naughton.
Thank you, Chairman. I think from all of the evidence that we've heard from all of the speakers, I think there's no disagreement that there needs to be some mechanism to implement the European Court of Justice judgment. And the evidence, I think, that we've heard from everyone is that there needs to be clarification in relation to the current Medical Council guidelines or practice that's in place. Now, I know that Dr. De Fuite was making the point earlier that the current Medical Council guidelines are crystal clear, but as I understand it, those guidelines have extended the grounds for the termination of pregnancy when you compare that to the previous editions of those guidelines. And those guidelines provide for suicidal ideation. And under the guidelines as they stand at present, a single specialist could make such a determination. Now, the evidence that we've received here was that up to 4 specialists in particular cases should sign off on that determination. And the guidelines will vary based on the composition of the Medical Council from 5-year term to 5-year term, which the people have absolutely no input into. And based on that, do you not feel that there is a need to legislate and set in statute what should be allowed and not allowed that is in current guidelines, rather than basing it on the next electoral college and the next group that's on the Medical Council?
Thank you, Deputy. Senator John Crone.
Thank you, Gormalgat Cahirlock, and I'd like to thank our guests. I've a question that I've asked earlier in the morning, and I'm going to repeat it. Basically, when we questioned our colleagues from the maternity hospitals, it appears that we probably have about 30 abortions a year right now, which are carried out for, unambiguous grounds of risk to the life as opposed to the health of the mother. Now, the consensus feeling of our colleagues was that there have not been any missed cases. They believe that there were no deaths, no maternal deaths which occurred because there was a reluctance to perform medically needed abortions because of religious or ethical scruples on the part of the doctor. This has not happened. None of them, they believe, were due to suicide. Okay? So it is likely, barring some unbelievable epidemiological, mischance, that we're talking about a phenomenon that we're legislating for approximately 30 medically necessary abortions a year to save the life of the mother. It is, I believe, extremely likely that nearly none of them will be on the grounds of suicide. So the question has to be asked, why is this one particular aspect of the legislation, or the proposed legislation, exciting such extraordinary interest? Now, there are 2 possible explanations. One of them is that there is going to be a major increase in the number of abortions, which are not, I need you to hear me on this now, because I do want an answer, that there's going to be a major increase in the number of abortions which are not bona fide on the grounds of the real threat to the life of the mother.
Thank you. 2 minutes up.
To the life of the mother. And if not, is there a suggestion that there will be feigned suicidality? Many people have denied that they believe there will be feigned suicidality, but there's a gap in the logic there somewhere. If it's not feigned suicidality, what is the mechanism whereby there will be a great increase in the number of quote-unquote illegitimate abortions which are not necessary on medical grounds? Thank you.
Senator. Deputy Seamus Healy.
Thank you, Cahirlock, and to thank the witnesses for their submissions. And I just want to continue with the question that Senator Crone has asked. Medical and legal witnesses over the last couple of days have stated categorically that legislation envisaged by the government will be very, very narrow and very restrictive. And one, if not more, have suggested that the number of cases we're dealing with is something in the order of 30. Now, the pro-life submission specifically disagrees with that, and it's like, in relation to what Senator Crone has said, for a clarification from them on that. The other question I wanted to ask is, in relation to fatal fetal abnormality, and particularly where the fetus would not be viable outside the womb, what is the view of our witnesses in relation to that?
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Regina Doherty.
Hi, good morning. Can I ask, it's with particular reference to the issue of suicide. Given that all of the experts that we've had here this week, and I think, Dr. O'Donnell, you're the 6th psychiatrist that we've had in, not one of them have said, and anybody else that I've spoken to has said, that abortion is not a treatment for somebody who's presenting with suicide. Also given the options in the expert report of how legislation could be framed regarding one obstetrician, one psychiatrist, one obstetrician, one cardiac specialist, depending on, the problem that the woman is presenting with. I actually, in my humble view, can see that if and when the legislation is passed, that there probably will be never a case, given the restrictions that we're proposing, that a woman, could potentially receive an abortion or be recommended an abortion. So I'm curious as to, knowing what you know and how you treat your patients, why there's such a huge concern for such a tiny amount of prospective, medical interventions, particularly when we're talking about suicide. What is your fear? I don't have obviously the expertise to know, when we talk about floodgates opening, where you see them opening, or what your fears would be potentially having passed legislation.
Thank you. Deputy Peter Fitzpatrick.
I have to mention again that the survey from the 3 Dublin maternity hospitals, Rotunda, the Hollis Street and the Croom, that from 1980 to 2011 found that 2 deaths occurred by suicide. Both occurred after delivery, out of a total of 680,000 live births. This is the proof that doctors are doing their best to protect mother and child. A lot of families in Ireland have experienced a suicide. And I have to make this statement, is we cannot have abortion on demand. I've asked this question to the last two groups for the last number of days. Women who have abortions, do they increase the risk of mental health, like depression, substance and abuse? I know people keep saying it's the same question I'm asking them again, but it's something they have to get out of my mind. And women who have abortions are more likely to commit suicide. And the last one then is motherhood. Does motherhood protect suicide? That's it.
Thank you. And finally, Deputy Mary Mitchell O'Connor.
Thank you, and thank you very much, witnesses. I just want to, yesterday I asked Dr. Simon Mills, he put forward draft proposals, heads of bills, and I'd like you to comment on that, because he said here that he thought that it would stand up robustly, in law. And then I'm very concerned as well. I heard somebody there say that there was no need for legislation, and that it was crystal clear, and that you're very happy with what's there and with the medical guidelines. And yet, I'm not a medical person and I'm not a legal person, but what I'd like to know, and again, for my constituents, is why would the master of Hollis Street Hospital, a mother herself of 4 children, come in here, with other masters and say that they're not happy, that they feel exposed, that they need clarity? I mean, I just can't get it as an ordinary person here. I'd also like to know, sorry, am I up? Time up? I'd like to know, do we trust the medical profession, be it they obstetricians and psychiatrists? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. We have 20 minutes remaining in this slot, so I'll allocate 5 fours, and if Ms Simmons wants to begin, please feel free to do so.
Right, thank you very much indeed. I think first of all, as there, Okay, I'll be very quick. First of all, in relation to suicide, the bottom line, I think, which is very much appreciated by people on the pro-choice advocacy side of this, is that legislation must include suicide because of the X case decision. You cannot excise the suicide element, and that's a fact, and they know that. So if they want legislation, they want to leave in suicide. Why are we concentrating on it? First of all, the medics will tell you, and you've heard abundantly clearly for the last couple of days, it is not ever the only, and it is not ever a treatment for suicidality. So that's that. In relation to Professor Crown's question, if he's finished looking at Twitter there, just to say to him, he has. We're all Twitterati. I support him in that endeavour.
We shouldn't make reference to what the member is doing.
I beg your pardon, but it's so attractive. It's pink here, and I'm looking at it. I can't do my eyes. I'm so sorry if it's offensive. Anyway, just to say, his question was asking, was I suggesting that anybody would feign suicidality or whatever? That's I've said there's a legal problem in relation to suicide. suicide, and there's a medical problem in relation to suicide. And in relation to feigning it, can I just tell him that when Dr. Anthony Clare spoke to the Oireachtas in 2000 at its hearings, he said that psychiatrists were hopelessly compromised once you put this into the psychiatric arena. And Lord David Owen, in fact, is on the record as having said that he coached his patients in order to present as suicidal. So we have to realise what human nature has to say in relation to this. So I hope that I make it clear. In relation to Deputy Healy's question on the lethal fetal abnormalities, that's not covered by the X case and it won't be included in this legislation. And I was very surprised then when I was looking at Simon Mills's draft to see that he had included both the health element and the lethal fetal abnormality element, because that won't be in legislation. It's not appropriate. I'd like to hand over now, please, to Dr. Barry Kiley.
Dr. Berry.
Just one small point that I'd like to make. Somebody, I'm sorry now, I don't remember who, made the point of everybody sort of is happy that all treatment can be given at the moment, so why are we afraid about legislation? Well, I think it's very interesting when you look at this, because actually, if all you were going to put in legislation was what is currently the practice, that legislation would actually look very different to what's being proposed by the expert group. Like an obstetrician at the moment who's treating this woman there in front of him or her can make the decision that he or she thinks is best. Under this new proposed legislation, they're not going to be able to do that, because they're going to have to get the opinion of yet another obstetrician or another doctor. I understood you were talking about getting two.
Debate for the past 3
But
days.
I don't mind taking a question, if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Sorry, but my understanding was that they asked for, in an emergency case, the Medical Council asked for no change, and the Master of Holles Street Hospital.
Actually, my point.
Yes.
Actually,
asked for no change in the emergency, so they don't need two obstetricians.
So in other words, this legislation is proposed to deal with something more than what we're currently doing. That's my point. You're being asked to widen what is current medical practice. You're being put in a position where you are now being asked to allow for more, a little more, a medium amount more, a lot more, I don't know. I have no doubt you will do your best to make it as restrictive as possible. But nonetheless, it clearly will be more than what is currently there and more than what is actually needed. And that of itself is already an opening of the door. It may be a small little chink, very small, very tight, but you look at the experience of any country around the world and you look and see what their experience has been once there has been, because basically what you're being asked to do is to lessen the value that's given to the life of the unborn. And once you say because this member of the human race, because it's unborn, it doesn't count for that much, then you're opening the gates. And I suppose, apart from anything else, to be honest, just being utterly simplistic and whatever about it, why have the pro-choice groups been advocating for this if it actually wasn't going to make any change whatsoever?
Thank you. And we shouldn't make reference to what members are doing. It's out of order. But
I do apologise to everybody in the chamber.
Thank you. Dr. De Vries, 5 minutes.
I'm just going to address what Deputy Burke and the lady deputy behind you asked, just in relation to Medical Council guidelines. I think it's my view, and I know this will be shared by a lot of medical professionals in the country, that the guidelines are crystal clear, and doctors do know when they can intervene to save the life of a mother. I think in the wake of the tragedy of Sofia Halappanavar,
make reference to that case.
Oh, sorry, I take that back. Very recently, Professor Fiona McAuliffe, who is the Institute's chairwoman, said that their doctors do know when they're intervening. They're perfectly entitled to intervene, and they're covered in the Medical Council ethical guidelines to intervene when a woman's life is at risk. Now, that being said, I never in any part of my submission said that I'm against legislation, that I'm against clarification whatsoever. I know my own understanding of the Medical Council ethical guidelines, but if it is shown through discussion and through debate that doctors do want further clarity and that they do want either legislative footing or further clarification of the Medical Council guidelines to allow them to practice medicine and to practice medical maternal health care, I would not be against that, nor would any pro-life person I know be against that. The problem I would have is that any legislation or any clarification or even guidelines that we do bring forward must recognise also the right to life of the unborn child, and must recognise that a doctor does everything he or she possibly can do to save the life of the mother, while at the same time recognising that he or she has a duty of care to the unborn child as well. And I'll just finish on this one point. I know it was brought up what the Master of the Maternity Hospital said during the course of these hearings recently, but I'd like to just bring our memories back a little bit to the Oireachtas hearings of 2000 and 2001, where we had extremely experienced obstetricians, the heads of the institute, testify before government officials, each saying the opposite, in fact, to what the Master of the Holles Street said during the week, that they know exactly when to intervene when women's lives are at risk, that they never put women's lives at risk when they're suffering a complication of pregnancy, and that in their mind, treatments for things such as cancer of pregnancy, ectopic pregnancies, severe preeclampsia, etc., those interventions do not constitute abortion. And I think it's extremely dishonest of the papers who had front page headlines yesterday, including the Daily Mail, blazing these headlines that 30 abortions are taking place in Irish hospitals every single year, when we do not know the circumstances of those cases. Some of those cases may have been a premature reduction of labour where a baby was delivered alive and survived. So I think we need honest reporting on those facts. Thank you.
Donald, 2 minutes. 2.5.
Okay. Several people asked the same question in relation to what's the huge fear around the suicide scenario in relation to the X case. And of course, the reason for it is that the X case judgment specifically dealt with abortion for suicidal risk. Now, there was no medical evidence provided before the Supreme Court in 1993, and that led to a seriously flawed judgment, in my opinion, in relation to the Supreme Court at that time, because the experts on the assessment of suicidal risk are consultant psychiatrists, and the evidence that was given to the Supreme Court at that time was given by a child and adolescent sex therapist. So probably not the best place to go looking for advice on suicide. The real concern is that our cultural cousins, if you like, in the United Kingdom and in the USA have had the experience of seeing the so-called floodgates opened in relation to suicide. In 1966, the year before the Abortion Act in Britain, the overwhelming majority of abortions were carried out under the cover of the 1938 Rex v. Bourne Act, where Sir Alec Bourne had carried out an abortion on a rape victim to protect her health. So that was the grounds up until 1966. With the passage of the Abortion Act in 1967, within 12 months of its enactment, over 95% of all applications for abortions were on risk of suicide. And in the United States, the exact same thing has happened. So we go from a situation of 80,000 abortions in 1966 to over 190,000, and most of those being on the grounds of risk of suicide.
Mr. Manley.
Thank you. I'd like to deal with Senator Crown's question, which I thought very important. Why is there so much emphasis on the question of suicide? Now, it is not, in my opinion, it is not because of numbers, it is not because of slippery slopes or floodgates. No, it is not that. It is because if legislation was passed, it would allow, for the first time in Irish law, the life of an unborn child to be directly and exclusively taken. Now, that unborn child, we have given in our Constitution the right to life, equal to the mother, equal to yours and mine. How can a law permit such an injustice? That is the problem. Now, the 30 cases of abortion that he mentioned, this raises, and it's already been mentioned, the whole difficulty of using the right words. The obstetricians who talked about their work on the first day spoke of their efforts to deal with 2 patients. Always, whatever intervention they had to make, when, say, heart trouble or cancer or something like that threatened the life of the mother, was to preserve the life of the mother, to save the life of the mother, and as far as possible and practical, to preserve the life of the child. Now, that is not an abortion. An abortionist in London has only one thing to do, and that is to take away the life of the unborn child. That's the only thing. And if he fails to do that, he will lose his job. Right. Do you want to say anything? Well, I just make another question. Somebody said, do we trust, I've forgotten who it was, do we trust our doctors and nurses? Yes, of course I do. And of course, all the people I know do also. I also trust our local guards. I also trust the teachers of my son. I trust the county councillors. And the politicians, do I trust them? Well, the kindness...
Order, please. Thank you.
The kindness and help that I've got being around here in the last few days has restored my trust in politicians. Thank you.
Good answer. Mr. Carr, you've got 2 minutes.
Just to pick up on a couple of points that were raised, Deputy Naughton pointed out that we do need a mechanism to comply with the ABC ruling, and that's clearly the case. He pointed out, and I think it's an important point, that the Medical Council guidelines will vary every 5 years, and indeed I think the successive editions of those guidelines have, from this particular perspective, become somewhat weaker in the sense that they have incorporated some of the thinking of the X-case decision. However, it may be possible to have guidelines other than those of the Medical Council, and I would see the Institute of Obstetricians having a major role to play in formulating such guidelines, since they are the people most directly affected, other than, of course, than the pregnant women, but they are the people who are seeking clarification. The fact, however, remains that guidelines, while they may satisfy the requirements of the ABC judgment, won't resolve the underlying issue, which brings us back to the X case, which can ultimately only be resolved either by a revisiting by the Supreme Court of its jurisprudence or by a referendum.
Time is up. Thank you. And finally, Mr. O'Brien and Ms. Steen.
The late, great Garret Fitzgerald was once alleged to have said, "That's all very well in practice, but will it work in theory?" Now, whether he actually said it or not, I'm really proud of having found a situation where that actually applies. Because what you have at the moment is wonderful practice. And the wonderful practice means that abortions are not carried out on the grounds of suicide, but genuine life-saving treatments are carried out. That's the practice. What you're proposing is to change the theory, or at least to enshrine it into legislation, which is actually somewhat different, and it's a very important step. And I could actually turn it around to you and say, if you think this legislation is never going to need to be used, why are you legislating for it? And the floodgates argument is not actually the argument that I would make, even though I do allow for human nature and I do allow for change in cultural norms, and I do take all of that seriously. The key argument to me is, will this help or harm women? And will this help or harm the unborn child? Now, sadly, and I say this, as I say, as someone whose family has been affected by suicide. Suicide is a terrifying reality, but it remains a possibility. And I'm one of the lucky ones where the person who is actively suicidal is alive. But there's an absolute certainty that if one is carried out on the grounds of legislation that you're not even entirely sure should be there, that's an absolute certainty that that child will die.
Thank you. 2 minutes.
Just briefly, I want to address two questions that were raised. The first by Deputy Mitchell O'Connor about your concerns in relation to the concerns raised by the Master of the National Maternity Hospital. I have spoken to a number of legal colleagues about this, many of whom disagree with my views on abortion, but all of whom are ad idem about the fact that there is no legal reality to a prosecution being brought under the 1861 Act against a doctor who acts in good faith with the intention of saving the life of the mother. There is simply no legal reality to that. There has never been a prosecution in living memory. But if, however, and while I say it's not necessary to amend the 1861 Act, which is still in force in Britain, if it were thought necessary to allay the fears of the medical community, then there could be a possibility of amending the 1861 Act with an addition to the effect that where a doctor acts in good faith with the intention of saving the life of the mother, in other words, explicitly stating it, that he or she shall not be guilty of an offence under the Act. But of course, what is very important also is that there be specific provision made in relation to protecting and vindicating the right to life of the child, of the unborn life also. So if that's in any way helpful, that would be a suggestion that I would make. And secondly, in relation to the floodgates argument, which I think was touched on by a number of the speakers, and I know Mr. Manley and Ms. O'Brien have discussed that a little bit, but I'd just like to say one further thing. Again, just to reiterate, the floodgates argument, while it is a concern, it's not of primary concern to those who hold pro-life views. What is of concern to those with pro-life views is the direct and intentional killing of an unborn child and the legislating for an unjust law. Now, if a law is talking about taking the life of an innocent life, then that law needs to be justified. Currently, we can justify it under current medical practice where a doctor acts to save the life. But if we are talking about enacting a law that directly and intentionally takes an innocent life, then it needs to be justified in even stronger terms.
Thank you.
I am against the death penalty personally, but in some jurisdictions it is justified on the basis that somebody has done something so awful that they have lost their right to life.
Thank you.
How can I agree with the idea of taking the life of an innocent child whose worst crime is its mere existence? Thank you.
Dr. Berry, you indicated you want to make one other remark.
I have to admit, now I've forgotten what it was because I thought you weren't going to let me in.
Our time is elapsed.
No, the question I asked was, do you trust your doctors and psychiatrists, not nurses?
Okay.
And the other question I asked was about Dr. Simon Mills with suicidality.
Deputy Doherty, very
around
briefly,
it.
and the witness can answer it in part of the other.
Thank you very briefly. It's only a very quick question to Dr. O'Donnell, just for clarification purposes. When he talked about when the law was passed in the UK, 95% of the abortions were arising from suicide intention. Does a patient or a pregnant woman in the UK, when she's proposing to have an abortion, does she have to go through a psychiatric assessment in order to obtain that abortion? And if so, are you suggesting then that the psychiatrists that those women present to in the UK are being duped?
Well, I can very quickly tell you about my experience in Jersey in 1997 when the Abortion Act was extended there. That one of my consultant colleagues in Jersey in 1997 had a stack of leaflets at the side of her desk, all of them which were previously ready stamped, and all that they required was the name of the patient to go out. So that we know from investigations in Britain going back as far as 1974 that has been repeatedly shown to be the case. The Sunday Telegraph has done undercover investigations which have also shown that. So yeah, it is something that we need to worry about.
Thank you very much. The time for the members is elapsed. And at this juncture, may I just acknowledge in the public gallery former member Geraldine Kennedy and former Minister Gemma Hussey, and also to acknowledge in the gallery two former members of staff, both Margaret Brady and Claire Fallon. You're all very welcome to the hearings today. Thank you very much. 20 minutes now for members of the Oireachtas who are not members of the committee. We have 9 names who have been submitted, and I want to start with Deputy Anna Reardon. And if members again can be brief, please, rather than engaging in speechifying. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair, and I want to welcome all the witnesses here today. I want to make 2 very brief comments, if I may. The first one is in relation to the suicide issue. I'm afraid that if people have come here to argue that suicide as a risk to the life of a mother should not be in this legislation, then they're here under a false premise. Because we have to legislate for the threat of suicide to the life of a mother, because that's the very basis of the X case which we are legislating for. The Constitution says under Article 34(6), the decision of the Supreme Court shall in all cases be final and conclusive. And we've had 2 referendums in Ireland to underwrite and to stand over that decision made in 1992. So we have to legislate for suicide. So my point to you is that this discussion we're having here is not whether or not we legislate for suicide, but how best that can be done. The second point I want to ask, and I want to particularly make sure that you answer this question. You're here to lobby politicians. I want to ask you, all of you, what type of lobbying do you believe on an individual basis is appropriate and inappropriate when lobbying politicians on this particular case,
Thank you,
on this
Deputy.
particular issue on a day-to-day basis?
Thank you. Deputy Flanagan.
Thank you. Thanks, Chairman. Question for Dr. O'Donnell. In your submission, you refer to a recent international symposium on maternal health in Dublin that confirmed that direct abortion was not necessary to save mothers' lives, and that this declaration has been signed by 400 doctors to date. Just if you give a bit of background to the declaration and what parts of the country are these doctors from, their qualifications and their specialties that they represent. For Miss O'Brien or Miss Steen, you raised the issue of mental health and the well-being of the father and other family members, something which you just said hasn't received much consideration during these hearings. Just if you could comment further on it, and what do you consider to be the main issues that arise in relation to this? You mentioned also the danger of normalising suicide as a response to stressful situations. Are you aware of any evidence that this occurs in relation to pregnancy? And in any case, can you say a little bit more about this problem? And for Family and Life, Mr. Manley and Mr. Carr, you expressed concern about how the definition of abortion, how it's defined. If you could comment further on that, and about necessary medical treatments and the difference. And I suppose out in the public domain, the confusion in relation to these terms that are used. You also make a distinction as well between the termination of pregnancy and the termination of the unborn. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Thank you, Deputy. Senator Fidelma Healy-Ames.
Thank you very much, Chairman and panel. You're very welcome. There has been a missing voice in these hearings, and it's the direct voice of the pregnant woman, the woman in crisis, the woman that has to face the real human dilemma. So far, we've only had secondary evidence. For that reason, I'm very grateful to Sean and Breda for going there insofar as you can. Sean, in assisting the 19-year-old suicidal woman post-abortion that you described here, what do you believe is the best framework we can now provide as legislators so that we can adequately help that woman that is suicidal? Caroline, do we have to legislate for suicide arising from the European Court of Human Rights request for clarification? And finally, Maria, you spoke as, I appreciate you putting your words into the hearing in terms of being the voice of an expectant mother yourself, so there is direct evidence here. My question is this. The obstetricians have asked us for flexibility. Are you saying that the current medical guidelines are legally adequate to protect both the mother's life and the doctor as a practitioner who said their primary reason was to preserve life?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Walsh. Senator Jim Walsh.
Yeah, I think Dr. O'Donnell and Dr. Feet, I think you've already been asked about the Dublin Declaration. Maybe if you could give us the specialties of those who attended, and also maybe the essence of the declaration, because I think it was Dr. O'Mahony, in fact, was quite dismissive of that declaration when she was before us. Can I just say as well, and this probably to Dr. Berry Kiley, all the evidence we've got, and maybe others as well might like to come in, but all the evidence we've got from the medics was that they've never found a situation where our current legal framework in any way inhibited them from giving best possible care and being able to interfere in whatever way they felt was best practice in order to save the life of a mother. Now, the fear of legislation has been raised, I understand, by certain obstetricians now, and I think there's a gathering number of them, I believe, and you referred to it, that are concerned that in fact now by prescribing legislation, we could in fact interfere with the current best practice in medical care, despite our intentions obviously not to do that.
Thank you.
And I'd like maybe if you could give us a comment in relation to that.
Thank you. And Senator Paul Bradford.
Person. Could I direct my question, please, to the female members of